Let's talk about the difference between staying clean and actually living for Jesus and doing things in sense of letting your life be a living sacrifice, not living for yourself. Uh, you can stay clean from outward appearances of sin or doing self-destructive behavior, so on and so forth, and not actually be holy. You can stay clean and not actually live for Jesus at all. That's what many cults are all about. That's what Seventh Day Adventists, Mennonites, Amish, a lot of people like that are focused on outward things that they abstain from uh, as some form of holiness, but inside they can be exceedingly wicked people. Or they just simply are living for themselves and going about life normally as religious people, but they're not actually living for Jesus. They're still living for themselves. So, no matter how clean you stay from, I don't know, smoking, drinking, drugs, pornography, uh, no matter how you dress, uh, no matter how often you go to church, no matter how well kept, you look, and no matter how obedient your children are, or how well you present yourself and your family to the world, uh, you can still be doing that and completely living for yourself. And actually, that type of stuff is not real holiness. Real holiness is dedication. It's a sense of dedication to Jesus Christ and his kingdom. And that's what Jesus talks mostly about in his parables. When you read Jesus' parables, he hardly ever even mentions things in there similar to not drinking or smoking too much, or things like that, those sorts of things. He doesn't mention things like how you dress. Of course, there is a mention of clothing in parables, but those are symbols for other things. And so this whole idea of staying clean and being presentable, being a decent person, people in the world do that. And the wickedest people in the world refrain from smoking and drinking and even sexual sin and things like that, either just for appearance sake or because they don't have time for it, or they know that it ruins their mind and body and brings them down in some way, and they don't want to be addicted to stuff like that. You could think of any of the richest people in the world right now that get touted as being so exceedingly wicked, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but likely a lot of those people don't drink that much, and they don't smoke, and they don't engage in much aberrant or sinful sexual behavior or things like that. They probably don't go around stealing from people. They do maybe in other ways that are far more sophisticated, but the idea is here is that Christianity, at least the type of Christianity that I grew up in, had this real idea of staying clean. When I was younger, my sisters all wore dresses. They wore these head covering handkerchief things on their heads. They wore these bloomer, which are like knickers, these big bloomer things underneath their dress. And I grew up in a culture like that, kind of almost semi-Mennonite-ish or something. And we were really, really focused on staying clean. If somebody smokes one joint, they're going to hell. Drink one beer, you're going to hell almost. And so we were really over focused almost completely on what you weren't allowed to do. And that's what I want to talk about in this series, is the idea of the kind of so-called holiness as far as what you aren't allowed to do, as opposed to the kind of holiness that would be aimed at what we should be doing, right? So this idea is still very strong within Christianity. Even the most liberal churches uh, will more or less focus on what you're not allowed to do. And that's the way they think of sin. That's the way a lot of people nowadays still, it was definitely like that 20, 30 years ago, more than ever. And we still have this concept of sin as something you do. Sin is also when you don't do things that you should do. So we need to separate this idea of sin, because there is sin of commission. So in old scriptural parlance, mainly from the Old Testament, there's this idea of sins of omission and sins of commission. Commission, right? A sin of commission is something you do. Therefore, it's a sin you commit. It's something you have to do. You have to get up and actually do something that's wrong to sin. But there's far more sin that's done, and there's far more types of sin, actually, that are because of what we don't do. So it's likely that most of us sin far more in what we don't do, right? Far more of our sin is a sin of omission than it is of commission. So you think of somebody that drinks and smokes and does drugs and goes to the club and sleeps around, and we think of that person as a sinner. But another type of person that's clean cut and has a family that acts nice and never drinks and smokes or does drugs or cheats on his wife or whatever, we think of that person as not a sinner, right? We don't think of that person as a sinner. So this term sinner is tends to be applied to people who habitually act out sins of commission, but not people who habitually fail or refuse to act and omit doing things that they should do, right? And we even see this phrase applied, I believe it was by the Pharisees. We'll go ahead and read it. In Luke chapter 7, 36 to verse 50, the end of the chapter, you have the woman who came and washed Jesus' feet. And it says that she was a sinner, meaning apparently she was a prostitute. And she obviously had been forgiven. I don't know the whole story behind her, but it says here in verse 37, and behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil. Okay, this happened once here, and it also happened right before Jesus was crucified. And so the writer, who's Luke, actually says that she was a sinner.